Welcome back to another Outdoor Philosophy here on Switched to Linux. So we are going to continue our study of Building a Bridge to the 18th Century by Neil Postman. And this is kind of a fascinating discussion here. We're talking this chapter about information. And it's kind of interesting because in our modern age, we talk about us being this information age. Of course, we have the information superhighway. I haven't heard that term in a while, but if you're an older guy like me, then you might have heard that term, and that was kind of an early term used for the internet. And I haven't heard it for a while, but it was called the information superhighway. And of course, Postman's talking here about information and looking at information through the Enlightenment period and saying, you can look through all these books on the Enlightenment and you won't find any real information, reference to the word information, because it really wasn't a thing to think about. Well, there was some way to transmit some casual information here and there. Of course, Henry David Thoreau on the hearing about the invention of it was either a telephone or telegraph, whatever it was. Is they're buffing this up as saying now a guy from Maine can have a conversation with a guy from Texas, and he says, why would a guy from Maine even need to talk to a guy in Texas? And of course, in his age, that made a whole lot more sense to say. In our age, we can understand. Of course, back then, all of our work was pretty much done where we are. Right now, I do pretty much none of the work in the town I live. I do a lot of work all over the country. All of the internet, all the information, all of the ability to communicate has allowed me to build a lifestyle exactly what I want in a place where I want. And I don't have to choose the place I work and how I work. I don't have to let where my occupation is dictate where I live. And that's kind of a fascinating trend, as I've read through, and I've talked about it before on the channel, the book 101 Ways to Simplify Your Life by, was it? I forget whoever it was. I forget the book. But she talks in there, of course, she was writing about simplicity, kind of before the word minimalism was known. She's talking about simplicity and living a more simple life. Of course, this is right off of the heels of the 80s. It was called the Roaring 80s because it was just this constant schedule. If you know somebody who's about 10 years older than me or so, you'll find that their life is very scheduled, very rigid, very direct. And in response to all that, people just started feeling like so spread all over the place. There was a small counter movement which came up and said, let's simplify our life. And in that simplification, one of the things she talked about is, figure out where you want to live, go move there, and then find a way to make an income. That was really hard to do in the 80s. That is excessively easy to do now. In fact, what I could do now here is I could actually pick the place I want to live, and I could do that if it's based upon, if I wanted to ski and surf in the same day. I might live, in the middle region of California where I'm an hour from the mountains and I'm an hour from the beach. That's an option. And that was hard to do back then because you move into the town you want. Of course, that's one thing. I got sidetracked from a train of thought. You could also say, well, I'm just starting out my online digital career, so I got to live somewhere that's cheap. So you could rent a backwoods cabin somewhere for a fraction of the cost it would cost to rent an apartment in this town. And, you could do that and live in a way that saves costs. But the problem is, in the 80s, and 90s and or 70s and 60s and 50s and back in the 18th century when Thoreau walked the earth, I think he was 19th though, then it was a lot harder to decide where you want to live and then figure out how to make money there. Due to the information we have now, it's now perfectly capable. Okay, why do I live in this town? Because I want to live in this town. I have no job obligation that drags me to this town. I have no job application that forces me to wake up at a certain time every day. I just don't have that. I've built a lifestyle I want because the information age allows us to do our telecommuting. In fact, later on today, I have a call out in, I think, Wisconsin or Michigan, or I don't know where the guy is. I've never met the guy personally, but I built some websites for him, so we're going to keep on working with him. I got guys in Boston, I got guys in Seattle, I got guys in LA, and I don't really want to work in any of those places. I don't want to live in any of those places, I should say. And the information age allows us to sit here and work on the way we are. Now, all that to say, what kind of happened is around the 18th century, we started to gather together the salons that served especially as a way to spread information. Of course, back in those days, of course, the only example I'm thinking off the top is Sweeney Todd, so maybe that's a bad example. But, you know, the old day barber shops used to be where you'd go to learn the news. You'd go to the barber shop for your shave, for your haircut, and for the conversation, and the barber was probably the most knowledgeable guy on earth because he got a chance to hear all of everything that was happening at the same time. Okay, and that's kind of an important thing. What ended up happening is we got this progression towards education that wants us to learn how to learn ourselves. And we talked about Rousseau as one of the important framers of this period of time. Well, he was actually saying there's no real need to read. He says, in fact, the only book he recommended anybody ever read is Robinson Crusoe, not for the wonderful piece of literature it is, but no, how to survive if you end up in a primitive land. That was kind of the only thing that Rousseau was really interested in. But then we had this big boom, and I know you atheists swallow really, really hard because the boom in education, it was at the hands of the Christians who said, we have got to learn what a Bible says. And so not only did they advocate translating the Bible into the native tongue, but they also encouraged reading, so much so that the colonists that were these closed-minded religious people that didn't want to do anything were actually the ones driving all education. The hospitals, the universities, the education, the grammar schools was all started by people who said knowledge is our key to move on. Swallow hard. I know that's counter to the narrative you like to believe, but that's the reality of what it is. Okay? Of course, Postman addresses this on page 84. The Bible, of course, was a central reading matter in all households, and since these people were Protestants who shared Luther's belief that printing was, quote, God's highest and extremest act of grace, whereby the business of the gospel is driven forward. Of course, the business of the gospel will be driven forward in other books as well, and they talk about the Bay Psalm book in 1640 was generally considered America's first ever bestseller. And the thing is that as settlers came into America, they set up the schools, they set up the hospitals, and in some places, in larger places, it was laws mandated to teach education, to teach how to read. Now, of course, they had different reasons. He writes down here, settlers came to America as readers who believed that reading was important in the New World as it was in the Old. From 1650 and onward, almost all New England towns passed laws requiring maintenance of a reading and writing schools, the larger communities being required to maintain grammar schools as well. In all such laws, reference is made to Satan, whose evil designs was supposed it could be thwarted at every turn by education. And there were other reasons why education was required, as suggested by the following ditty, popular in the late 17th century. From public schools shall general knowledge flow, for 'tis the people's sacred right to know. Now, I'm going to stop and pause right there because while we had at that point in time, it was all to educate you against the schemes of the devil. As secularism moves on, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, this is not a lot different from our current model, but it still doesn't work. We believe that people are out there using drugs because they just don't have enough education to know drugs are bad. Wrong answer. That's not the case. The reality is education is not a means to our ultimate glorification. It just isn't. Education is good. We need to know stuff. But we can't say education is the chief, the end all, the know all. Because we are not intellectual beings. We are actually emotional beings. You got to get your emotions under control in order to move on. That is what the reality is. All right. And so Literacy was closely connected to school, which in turn connected to enormous proliferation of information. We may wonder then why the late 17th century and 18th century are not commonly referred to as the age of information, and Neil Postman says he thinks that the answer is the concept of information is different than what it is today. And this is kind of the subject matter of his chapter. That was 10 minutes of an introduction for a video that hopefully isn't going to go a ton longer. All right. So what he is arguing here is that what we have now as information is more information overload. It's not the reality of what we need nearly as much as it is. It's the stuff that we can't quite learn wisdom from the information that we have. So he talks here about newspapers. He talks about, of course, the first newspaper, America's first newspaper, was published in 1690, indicated that its purpose was to combat the spirit of lying, which then prevailed in Boston. Okay, well, that's interesting. So, of course, the newspapers and things were to spread information. And the information at that time, what it tends to sell more often than not in our world, because guess what, we're emotional beings, not intellectual beings, is bad news. That's why bad news sells. You're more likely to click on something if you think it has a tragedy attached to it than you do if it has some good or great news attached to it. We don't want to hear about the great, wonderful blessings. We want to hear about the tragedies of the world, because maybe it makes us feel better in our own literal miserable lives. All right. And so what he goes on to say here is that, oh, this was an interesting section about myth information. Maybe we could call fake news myth information instead of it. It's not misinformation, it's myth information. All right. He says, good news is we have it. The bad news is that in solving it, we've created another problem never before experienced, is information glut. Information is garbage. Information divorced from purpose or from meaning. As a consequence, there prevails what Langdon Winter calls the myth information. He says, no lisp intended. It is an almost religious conviction that the root of our difficulties, social, political, ecological, and psychological, is the fact that we do not have enough information. Okay. Now, the reality is we have, in many ways, too much information. We have way too much of it. Too much information. All right. So he says down here that this is sheer foolishness, and the 18th century savant would surely tell us. If there are people starving in the world, it is not caused by insufficient information. If crime is rampant in the streets, it is not caused by insufficient information. If children are abused, wives are battered, that has nothing to do with insufficient information. Once again, we are intellectual beings, we are emotional beings, not intellectual beings. My apologies. So our schools are giving us all the education. The question is, what are we doing with it? And that is where Postman gets in here. He's addressing the fact that we have too much information, and it's getting worse. He wrote this in 1999. It wasn't nearly as bad then as it is now, where all we just have is this pure spread of pure information. Okay, devoid of context, devoid of anything. The president can give a wonderful speech. In fact, the greatest example is when he was addressing the M13 gang, and he says, you know, these people, he says, you know, we've stopped a certain number of M13 gang members from crossing the border, and says these people are animals and all that. Of course, the people that don't like President Trump grab on to all that and say, oh, look at this, he just called all these people coming across the border animals. No, you moron. He called the M13 gang members animals. And I actually have a friend with a sister in the regions where they are, and I think it's El Salvador. She said, they will strip you dead, murder you, and beat you in the streets. They are a horrible, horrible gang. They are animals. That's all they are. Animals. Trump wasn't talking about all Mexicans coming over the border. He was talking specifically about that one gang, okay? And as he's talking about that one gang, people are taking his information completely out of context. Okay, so all this brings Postman to this final thought. What is information and how much of it do people need? Now, he's going to go on to address that it's not the information we need, it's what we can glean from the information. Okay, so what he wants to talk about, here he's talking about too much information. Here I'm addressing the problem that no cultures faced before, the problem of what to do with too much information. One answer, of course, is to make oneself inaccessible to it. Some people do this, I among them. As I mentioned, I do not have email. To take only one example, because it would make me the target of carloads of messages, almost all of which have no fundamental bearing on my life. I've developed other means of withdrawal, as have many other people, although it is not easy to do. All right. And so he's talking about it. So he says here, my focus here is at least one medium, the newspaper. How can that assist everyone? Now, I'm not sure we necessarily just want to go back to reading the newspaper. I'm going to disagree with Postman on this point. I like the fact that we have a lot of information, but I agree we at times have too much of it and not necessarily in context. Of course, the whole concept of fake news has been thrown around like gospel truth for a long time, and the unfortunate thing is that the definition of fake news has morphed into anything the establishment doesn't believe or doesn't want to be true. You know, and that's kind of what has happened in the realm of fake news and whatnot else. All right. So where he's going to bring us to ultimately is a question of knowledge versus wisdom. What use is it to have a bunch of disjointed facts? It's not. In fact, Postman says in some of his other books, it's either Disappearance of Childhood and or Amusing Ourselves to Death, where he addresses the fact that the TV news at night it's to give you such small sound bites, so quick and so disjointed that you cannot possibly process the information. And that's kind of part of the issue, because once we get to this point of having too much information, what do we do with all this information? Do I care if a terrorist was killed in Bosnia? No, I don't care. Okay, I don't. Sorry. If I lived in Bosnia, I might care, but I don't. Okay, and it's not rude or mean. That's that I'm sorry, I'm not God. I can't have solemn compassion for the entire world simultaneously. Okay, I just can't. I'm not concerned what goes on in Bosnia right now. Now, if I were planning to travel to Bosnia, I might be a little bit more concerned about it. But the fact is, I can't. Just like I can't be focused on necessarily, you know, who died in a car accident downtown Beijing today. My sincere apologies to the family, not apologies. Person who died in the car in Beijing, you know. I mean, my sincere condolences to the family, but I don't care. Okay? It doesn't have much bearing on me right here. Okay? And so he says, we have a great deal of knowledge about the world, but entirely lack wisdom. That is frequently the case with scientists, politicians, entrepreneurs, and academics, even theologians. Theologians, that's a good example I know a lot about. You know, there's the theologians who can know a lot about the Bible, but be devoid of the heart. And politicians got the same way. Now, he addresses the issue of cloning, because that was kind of a big thing when this book was written. So as cloning goes on, the scientists can tell us how we can clone a sheep or a monkey or maybe even a human, but it can't possibly ask the question of should we. That's for the realm of the humanists, for the theologians, for the politicians, for all of the other groups to duke it out in the public sphere to talk about. And then maybe we can use that knowledge to build on that knowledge to gain the wisdom, should we be cloning things or not. And so he talks about newspapers. He says, don't think that a newspaper editorial is wisdom. It's not. An editorial is an opinion. And of course, we get this on internet too. There's internet editorials, and there's a lot of opinions on the internet. And, you know, we should all be free to express our opinions, but don't be forced to live by those opinions. And then finally, he addresses what is wisdom. It is down to the difference between dogmatism and education. Any fool can have an opinion. To know what one needs to know to have an opinion, that is wisdom. Which is another way of saying that wisdom means knowing what questions to ask about knowledge. Going back to our doorknob. Wisdom is saying, do I need a doorknob that I can talk to and open? Wisdom is saying, do I need to have a smartphone that constantly tracks what I'm doing? Wisdom is saying, do I need to give Google and Spotify and Facebook my real birthday? The answer to these questions is no, you don't. Okay, wisdom is asking that question, and we are in such an unwise world right now, and we need to remember that. So Postman concludes. I'm going to read his concluding 2 paragraphs here because they were very good questions about information. He says, "Do I ask too much of editors and too much of newspapers? Perhaps, but I say what I do because I believe we now live in a world of too much information, confusing, specializing knowledge, and too little wisdom. Journalists may think it is not their job to offer the wisdom. I say, why not? Who can say where there is responsibilities as journalists send? This much we can say, and ought to. The problem to be solved in the 21st century is not how to move information, not to the engineering of information. We solved that problem long ago. The problem is how to transform information into knowledge and how to transform knowledge into wisdom. If we can solve that problem, the rest will take care of itself. And that's the reality. We need to stop overloading on information and glean some wisdom from this. That's kind of why I do the news, and I try and focus on solutions rather than, hey, this was hacked. Hey, that's not secure. Hey, this company's collecting data. The ultimate end point, the wisdom I'm trying to teach in all this stuff, is to think about the information you are spreading on before you spread it. That's the thing to do. Learn from the mistakes of the past, otherwise you will be doomed to repeat them.